Hello and welcome to Maiden Mother Matriarch. My guest today is Dan Hitchens, Senior Editor at First Things magazine. We spoke about assisted suicide, the second and third order consequences of legalisation, why low fertility welfare states are increasingly drawn to this apparent solution to their financial woes, and why Britain's National Health Service would prove to be a particularly dangerous provider of assisted suicide services. We also spoke about whether the influence of Christianity is waning in Britain and what we can deduce about the future of the faith in this country. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you find the conversation as interesting as I did. Dan, for those who are not in Britain or have not necessarily kept track of this, maybe we should start by talking about where we're at in terms of the assisted dying bill. First of all, have I got the name right?
I tend to say assisted suicide because we'll maybe get onto this more,
Yes.
but I think it's a clearer term.
I tend to say that too, but is the bill called assisted dying?
It's actually called Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, which you could argue is a euphemism, or you could argue it's just how they like to phrase these things. Whatever you want to call it, and it's a big question worth getting into. We're sort of on the brink of passing it in Britain. So it's got over what you would think would be its biggest hurdles, which are the 2 votes in the House of Commons. And now it goes to the House of Lords, the upper house, but nobody's entirely sure what will happen there. So the national debate goes on, but it looks quite close to becoming law.
And how does this proposed law differ from other countries in terms of the specific implementation?
It is modelled probably on places like Oregon and New Zealand, where there's a specific diagnosis you need to have. So the doctor needs to say you've got an irreversible condition and you've got 6 months to live. And the proponents of the bill will say that's very different from the Netherlands, where you could just have a psychiatric condition. You could just have severe anxiety and depression and sign up to receive lethal drugs. Or Canada, which has gone down that path where you don't necessarily need to have a time within which doctors expect you to die. You could just have a severe medical condition. So they'll say it's much safer than that because someone has to give you 6 months to live. The criticism of that, which has come from doctors and medical researchers, is that 6 months to live is quite a vague term, and doctors tend to refer to it as a bit of a coin flip. There's research suggesting that about a fifth of people who receive a 6-month diagnosis are still around 3 years later. So it's kind of more precise than other countries, but it potentially runs into the same problems of applying to lots of people who are not the people who are on the media or you might imagine would be first in line for an assisted death.
So the idea is that there are safeguards in place. It's not going to be the Wild West like it has turned out to be in places like the Netherlands seems to be the most infamous, possibly followed closely by Canada. How would you assess, say, the Oregon or the New Zealand models, which Britain is attempting to emulate?
Well, they have the same problems that all these laws have, which is that it redefines how we think about suffering and how we think about what we owe to the vulnerable. So that the current law basically says, as a society, we're not going to help you to commit suicide. Like if someone is in so much despair or pain that they want to end their life, as a society, we rally around and try and do everything we can to protect them and help them. And the head of the National Suicide Prevention Strategy for England, Sir Lewis Appleby, has said he opposes having an assisted suicide law in England and Wales because it removes that fundamental basis of suicide prevention. And it effectively says that in some cases, when people say, I've had enough, just help me die, we're not going to help them. We're going to say, yes, we'll do everything we can to, confirm that and enable it. And I think every country tries to find some way of limiting that possibility and saying, well, we'll just have it for these people, just have people who are in severe pain right at the end of their life. They're in terrible suffering and they can either die of their illness in May, or they can die of it in April, and it's just a question of whether they get control over their death. That's the sort of idealized case. And I think Oregon and New Zealand have been chosen as models for this bill because they do have more restrictions than places like the Netherlands, where you can get it for depression, or Canada, where you can get it without a terminal diagnosis. I'm not sure that the British experience will therefore be more like somewhere like Oregon than somewhere like Canada, because a key feature in Britain is that we have the NHS. In Oregon, if you want to find a doctor to support your assisted suicide application, it's really difficult. And I think the head of the kind of national association or the local association for assisted suicide in Oregon has said that only about 1 in 25 of people who try and start the assisted suicide process actually get to take the lethal drugs at the end of it, because Oregon's system has all these different insurers, all these different providers. It's kind of a maze. Whereas the NHS is quite good at streamlining these things. So in a way, Oregon has a huge natural safeguard of not having an NHS in the way that we have. And that might be more decisive than whether you have a 6-month definition or a suffering definition or whatever it is.
Yes, for all of the flaws of the American healthcare system, it also strikes me that actually having a largely privatized system acts that there are other perverse incentives within such a system, but there isn't the incentive to remove expensive users.
Right. And I mean, this is something I think you've recently written about, Louise, as well, that there is a huge visible strain on the welfare states that were built after the war. And particularly in Britain, so much of politics now is about this national agony about us not being able to afford a welfare state. And so there just is a built-in incentive, even though almost nobody would come out and say it, to say, we're going to save loads of money if some of these people will just die and take themselves off our hands and not be a drain on the national purse. I mean, it sounds very brutal, but there's something very seductive in that way of thinking. And that is, a very real prospect, I think, for the UK, because we're just at the beginning of this crisis, which you should probably talk about because you described it so well, where you have falling birth rates, you have a smaller and smaller working age population paying taxes to support the health and welfare system, with increasing numbers of elderly people who are, in inverted commas, not contributing. I think I've got your piece here, actually.
I've cannily, what I've done is I've invited you on in order to flatter me. Maybe you could read it aloud. No, I'm joking.
Do you want the whole thing?
I actually got so much pushback for that piece from New York Times readers. And I got some really, really vicious emails, even more so actually than when I wrote a piece for them defending Elon Musk, which also didn't go down very well. But the most common response was essentially to kind of disregard. So the argument I made, I mean, you've already summarized it really, is that as welfare states become more and more stressed by the birth rates problem, there will be an incentive to expand the availability of assisted suicide, because that's one way out for cash-strapped governments. And probably the most common response I had were people just not engaging with that at all, just ignoring that element of the argument and saying, but I want to be able to kill myself at the time of my choosing. Just, I personally want this, was just an overwhelming kind of clarion call from the New York Times readership.
Yeah, and emotionally an understandable one. But, parliaments debating this have to be able to think about what is the bigger picture with it. How does it affect the whole of society? It's actually an interesting point made by a former very senior figure in the NHS who is opposed to the legislation here, who used to be in charge of commissioning treatments. He was the head of NICE, which, is the kind of government body which chooses which treatments and medicines and so on we're going to license. And he said that people would always say to him, if you had a family member suffering from this, wouldn't you want to do everything for them? I.e., how can you not want to pay for the NHS to provide this? And his response was, absolutely, but I have to be able to think about how this affects the whole of society and absolutely everyone using these services. And he said it's the same thing with this. You have to be able to move from what would I want, or indeed what would I want for my loved ones, to there are, in the British case, 70 million people this affects. How does it change things for them? Who is most affected? What does it do to our values as a society? And this is one reason why a lot of the opposition to assisted suicide laws always comes from the sort of old left, proper socialists, or indeed just people on the left who have some sense of the common good and solidarity and so on, who say, I might want this for myself, but I can see how the people who get dragged into this are, people who are suffering from depression, people who have been let down by the health system, people who are isolated, exactly the people we should be supporting. And just as I'm against individualism in economics, like I don't just believe we should let the free market rip because of all the sort of collateral damage. So we have to put the people who would be collateral damage first here. But I think that is something you see constantly, as the two sides sort of speaking past each other.
Yeah, it is the job of governments to think about second and third order effects. And most people don't think about those things. And, fair enough, like most people aren't, it's not their job to do that. But I feel like one of the problems that we have in thinking about the second and third order effects of this policy is that I sense a kind of an allergy within the political mainstream to talking about such things. I mean, we saw this recently with Labour's efforts to cut welfare spending, and that symptomatic of what we've talked about already in terms of welfare states being highly stressed. Their efforts to cut welfare spending, even by I think it was less than 5% of the annual bill, provoked a backbench rebellion, and they couldn't do it. And the overwhelming resistance from Labour and others on the left was that why don't you just give infinite money to why not be more compassionate, etc. And it was the possibility of there being trade-offs here just wasn't. It seemed to be impossible to say that, at least within that faction in government. And I think that that's a wider problem, that there's almost a suspicion of there's a deep suspicion of the motives of anyone who raises this possibility of unintended consequences or of trade-offs. That's my impression.
Yeah, and it's partly, sound bites and the difficulty of making more complex arguments in the current sort of social media maelstrom. I think, to be fair, with the welfare cuts, there were Labour opponents of that who would say, we agree there needs to be welfare reform, we can see the fiscal crisis, but you've done this in a sort of amateurish, hasty way, without consulting, and it'll create all these problems if you pass this specific legislation, not if you do any kind of welfare reform. But it's true that this is a dilemma which I have no idea how to solve, and I don't know if anyone knows how to solve that. A lot of people's ability to live a basically decent life is dependent on a welfare state, which it's going to be really hard to pay for, and increasingly so.
Yeah.
It's a really horrible dilemma, I think, for government, and I'm not sure I trust the people who don't think it's a dilemma.
I suppose what a proponent of assisted suicide would say potentially to this is a really painful dilemma, and there's no magic money tree coming to save us. Like, it is just the case that welfare spending is going to decline over time, And without a solution to the birth rates problem, which I don't think is coming anytime soon, if you don't provide legalized assisted suicide, you're condemning people to very poor and miserable and potentially undignified final years. And wouldn't it be better, at least to provide the choice to people to go out with dignity and voluntarily, aged say 70, rather than go out aged 80, having spent your final decade living in squalor without the state pension that you thought would come and never did. That would be, I guess, the realist take. You don't hear that, as you say, I don't think that's made often explicitly, but that would be an argument that you could make, which could be persuasive.
I think the only person who's made that argument explicitly is Matthew Paris in The Times, who...
And The Spectator, I think he's rated as well.
And The Spectator, who just says, yes, people are going to feel like a burden. That's because they are a burden. And it would be great if they just accepted that and ended their lives when they were no longer useful to society. And he has a line about, opponents of assisted suicide saying these laws are the thin end of the wedge and you'll end up with it expanding to millions of people. And he says, well, what's wrong with the thick end of the wedge? That would be great. Yeah. Otherwise we'll be overtaken by China because we can't make the numbers add up. I guess the first thing to say about that is that it's definitely not how these laws are presented to the public. And if they were presented like that, I think they would be incredibly unpopular. It would be a totally different debate we were having. Now, you might say, well, we even need to bite the bullet on this kind of unpopular argument. But that does just seem, firstly, a sort of humanitarian catastrophe that we're just going to kill off a large amount of our population. And secondly, definitely a vote for despair. That is kind of the end of a country, isn't it? When you say, we'll just use death as a solution for our pressing problems because we can't work out what else to do.
Mm.
One of the great achievements of post-war Britain is the hospice movement, which is an amazing thing. It kind of comes from one doctor in London who thought, isn't there a better way to care for the dying? And with others and with antecedents, but very much through her own inspiration, builds this international movement of hospice care and, trying to give the very best care to people at the very end of their lives, because she thought that was maybe the most important time of people's lives. And then it spreads all over the world and becomes this great cause, and medical professionals devote their lives to palliative care. And that is an amazing thing. And that didn't need to happen. And it happened out of idealism and hope. So if we now abandon that, especially in the country which gave birth to the hospice movement and said, actually, I think it's a better idea if we give everyone a huge overdose of barbiturates when their time comes, that would really be lights out territory.
This episode is sponsored by Relay, one of those brands that's just such a perfect fit with MMM. I think what they're doing is excellent. Relay is an app that helps people stop using porn. And let's be honest, porn is basically everywhere on the internet. Most men see it first as teenagers. It quietly becomes part of life. But over time, it leaves a mark. You're more distracted, less present, less patient. It eats away at integrity, makes secrecy feel normal, and creates distance in your relationships. Many men feel stuck in the cycle, ashamed, frustrated, and wondering if change is even possible. That's where Relay comes in. It's therapist accredited and built on solid therapeutic principles, but the real difference is that you're no longer fighting alone. Relay places you in a private group with other men on the same journey, giving you daily accountability, encouragement, and tools to handle triggers whenever they pop up. You can stay totally anonymous while getting the real support you need to build a life of integrity. It's about becoming the husband, the father, the man that you were meant to be. Relay has already transformed the lives of thousands of men and the lives of their partners. Don't let the pattern continue. You don't have to stay stuck. Go to joinrelay.app/Maiden and use the code Louise. That's all capital letters Louise to try it out for free. That's joinrelay.app/Maiden. Yeah, I mean, of course, there are societies, or have been societies, which take that more brutal attitude towards burdensome individuals within the group. Like, I mean, I don't know how I've not really looked into the history of anthropology deeply, but the story of Vikings throwing themselves off cliffs and of old people being in Inuit societies being pushed off on ice floes and so on. Like, it's not, and these are, of course, societies that often practice infanticide on a fairly mind-boggling scale. So it wouldn't be historically unique for Britain or any other Western country to turn towards that more ruthless way of doing things. But it would certainly be a serious departure from where we're at now. And as you say, things like the hospice movement, the whole principle behind the foundation of the welfare state, which is now kind of undoing itself.
Yeah, it would be a historical turning point. Interestingly, Nigel Farage, who you don't hear making this kind of argument that often, said he opposed the legislation partly for the reasons that most politicians oppose it if they oppose it, about all the people who could be affected by it who might have lived if they had better support. But he also said it would be a great blow to Britain's status as a Christian country.
Did he?
Yeah, which I was really struck by, because he's, whatever else he is, he's quite good at intuiting what makes sense to people and what the common feeling is. And I don't know if everyone would, I don't know how many people would say that, but there is some sense that we have certain values. In Britain, care is a huge value. We've made a national symbol of the NHS, national religion, as some people say, and that has its problems. But it's quite impressive that we've made this our collective ideal, caring for the sick. Again, to do away with that would be a very significant change in how we understand ourselves and what we base our sense of the goodness of the country on.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that when people make defences of assisted suicide, they normally do so using Christian values. They wouldn't describe them as such typically, but they'll say that this is the compassionate thing to do to people who are suffering, or this is providing autonomy to people. But they're prizing care and individual freedom. Those are values that come to us from our Christian heritage, obviously tempered by other values within the proper framework, but that
Right.
what you don't hear, except rarely. So even Matthew Paris, I don't think would go this far, but someone like Richard Hanania does sometimes, to say that actually it is good for what Matthew Paris said, I think, quite carefully in his Spectator article on this last year. He didn't say, I think it would be good for people to rid society of their burdensome costs. He said, people will inevitably come to think this, right? The only person I can think of who just says that straightforwardly in terms of political commentators is Richard Hanania, who says sometimes that it's actually virtuous and brave to take the plunge and kill yourself so as to lessen the cost of your care on other people. But yeah, that's, I mean, and that's kind of, that's full pagan, right? But he's a real outlier. What you overwhelmingly hear is people making an argument for a very non-Christian practice with Christian rhetoric.
Right. The Vikings presumably weren't saying to themselves before throwing themselves to their death, like, oh, I think this is the compassionate option.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So, yeah, and in a sense, these are this does resolve itself into a question about where do we direct the focus of our compassion? Is it towards the person who is at the end, who has had all the help the medical care can give and still is desperate to die, who's pleading with their family to help them end it? Or is it with, the person with a disability who, because of the illnesses associated with that, can just about get a 6-month diagnosis and is suffering from depression and now would be helped, but under a change of law would be ushered towards the exit. And it can seem as though the two sides just each have an image in their head of who they're worried about and who they want to protect. In that way, it can be a dialogue of the deaf, as we've been talking about, but there is some common core there that caring for the suffering is a cause that we ought to devote ourselves to.
Yes, I think you're right about both sides having two idealize is the wrong word, but thinking of two different types of suffering and two imagined individuals suffering in exactly that way. Except I think in general that the people who are opposed to assisted suicide realize that the trade-offs are there. Whereas my impression, maybe I'm being ungenerous, is that the proponents of it don't tend to think about that. They don't. I don't think I've ever heard, say, a parliamentarian say, "I completely accept that there will be serious costs to this at the individual level, at the societal level, but I still think this is the right thing to do."
That's my impression,
Yeah.
based on a couple of experiences of debating with proponents of this legislation, and I think others have had this as well, a curious kind of narrow focus where people can't even see or acknowledge that there might be an argument against the law, which is odd given that it is quite a lively and noisy debate. But I think that is true, and you can see that as well in the way that this legislation has gone through Parliament, because it had a few months on and off of parliamentarians proposing amendments to make the law safer, and things like, if you apply, you have to have a guaranteed meeting with a palliative care consultant so you can talk about all of your options and not just getting the assisted death you're applying for. And that was rejected. Or you can't, if you're a doctor, bring up assisted suicide with someone who's under 18 who wouldn't be eligible, but especially given they're not eligible, you can't raise it with under 16. Again, that was rejected by the proponents of the bill as well. And things that seemed very reasonable would all get voted down. And that seemed almost inexplicable, except when you think there's a reluctance on the part of people pushing this kind of legislation to think there are trade-offs here, there are unintended consequences. Even though one thought that was what politics was all about, was weighing these things up and trying to strike a difficult balance.
Yeah, well, I suppose when you have the sort of campaigning fervour and the feeling that, because this has been framed very successfully by proponents as the next frontier in terms of emancipating people and of throwing off the superstitions and I mean really quite explicitly just rejecting the religious barriers to legalizing something like this. I mean, I think I'm sure I read and heard parliamentarians talking with irritation, really, about the religious lobby and the religious objections from some of their colleagues to this, and just seeing it as ridiculous. That was certainly something I got from readers of my New York Times piece. That was a common response, just to see it as absurd.
Definitely, and to see this as somewhat inevitable, as you say, as the next frontier, Kim Leadbeater, who's the MP who sponsored this bill and piloted it through the House of Commons, said in an article there was a lot of controversy about, I forget which two examples she chose, probably two out of same-sex marriage, abolition of capital punishment, and legalization of abortion. And she said, now there isn't any debate about those things, which may not be quite accurate. But she said, in time, I believe this will come to be seen in the same way. There'll be a total consensus on it. That belief that you're on the right side of history, I find it hard to use that cliche without smirking, but there are definitely people who at least implicitly believe that this is, whether or not it's a great liberation, it is just the next thing that we can accomplish. And maybe there's some anxiety there for progressives that they're running out of those things and that people seem a bit less interested in being liberated than they used to be. It's not totally clear if you're progressive what your great cause should be. Maybe this will do, at least as something for the moment, as a way of liberating people. Now you have the right to die as well as the other rights you've gained.
Yeah, well, of course, the great cause until recently, still is to some extent, is transgenderism, which has often been framed in the same way, like this is gay rights or abortion rights or whatever 2.0. I see that it's a seductive way of viewing history, but it's I don't know if I'm just being excessively partisan here, but it seems to be an obviously dangerous way of viewing history because it means you can fold all sorts of things into this linear crusade. You know, things just get better and better as long as we cross these various social frontiers. And yeah, I mean, also, it's funny Kim Leadbeater talking about capital punishment in that way because actually, that's actually a point, of course, where Parliament is in keeping with Catholic social teachings, but is not in keeping with the general public, which has never stopped supporting capital punishment. It's still the YouGov do a tracker, and it's still the case that a really solid majority of people support capital punishment, at least for some crimes.
Right. I can't remember which examples exactly she used, but those are the ones that come round at the reforms of the 60s.
Yeah, and it's a very common view that the very idea of debating capital punishment is crazy. And I see it as one of the clearest examples, just in terms of the numbers, on a massive gap between what parliamentarians think and what the general public think. And actually, to be fair, you'll probably know the numbers better than me. The general public do actually mostly support assisted suicide.
They do, though. I'm not just saying this, it's an observation that's widely made that the polling on this is quite unstable because if people are then presented with opposing arguments or with conditions, or would you support a law under these circumstances, the support falls really quickly. So essentially one of the biggest pushers of the bill in Parliament is an MP called Jake Richards, who has really campaigned hard for an assisted suicide law, but he says he doesn't think it's honest to make arguments on the polling because of all this research. And for instance, I mean, there have also been polls done on questions like, should the drugs that are used in the actual assisted death be licensed by an official regulator? And absolutely everyone says, yes, if there's going to be a law, it has to be with licensed drugs. But in fact, no regulatory authority anywhere in the world has licensed drugs for assisted dying. And there's quite a bit of debate about whether these deaths are guaranteed or likely to be peaceful and painless, or whether they're actually causing severe pain and discomfort themselves. And when people start thinking about that issue, they think, well, maybe I wouldn't support the law. Or indeed, should people who are suffering from depression, and that's their reason for applying, be able to receive an assisted death? most people also say that shouldn't be in the law. But these laws are framed so that as long as you have a 6-month diagnosis, if your sole reason is I'm lonely or I'm depressed, you qualify. So once you start to unravel and push into it, those polling numbers drop and you get all kinds of different views. That is not me saying, therefore the polls don't count for anything, or therefore there's some secret majority who absolutely agree with opponents like me. But there is, I think, some dishonesty in proponents of the change who act as though they're on this wave of popular support, when people who look at the polling go, there's a lot going on here which is not captured by the question the pollsters are asking.
Yeah, and the general public are very fickle about polling. I mean, returning to the capital punishment example, last time I checked the YouGov tracker, if you ask people, should we bring back capital punishment, a narrow majority say no. But then if you ask them, how about for terrorists? They're like, oh, yeah, okay. And then you say, how about for child killers? And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. And then all of a sudden, like you've mentioned literally one exception, and a massive chunk of respondents change their mind, which was also true for transgenderism. So early on, I think, because actually the public in general are quite sold on this next frontier progressive kind of framework. And I think early on, the view on questions like, should you allow people to change their legal sex? Should you allow access to opposite sex spaces, etc.? Most people were like, oh, yeah, okay. And then as time went on, and I think more and more disagreeable examples of these provisions being exploited came to public attention, people really turned against it, and you saw a big swing. So I think you are right that the point of representative democracy is to not just do everything by referendum. The problem with our representative democracy is it's so often not really representative at all. But maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, I think with the gender thing, I'm sure I read something about the polling on this, that if you ask, do you think that someone should be able to identify as the opposite sex, people are quite relaxed about that because it sounds live and let live. But then there are other ways of framing the question which make it clearer that this has a social impact if we redefine man and woman, let alone when you get onto questions about sports teams and prisons and public bathrooms, and the numbers completely change. So these are, one, they're issues where polls are unstable. Two, they're issues where quite a lot of people change their mind quite rapidly when they look into it. I think assisted suicide is the number one issue I can think of where people start off saying, this sounds great. In fact, I campaign for it. And then get interested in the subject and come out saying, this is a terrible idea, or at least I'm on the fence.
This is not the end of the episode. Actually, we're only halfway through, but the rest of the show is behind a paywall. In the extended version, Dan and I spoke about what new assisted suicide and abortion legislation reveals about the state of Christianity in modern Britain, whether or not the quiet revival, so-called, is really happening, whether or not we're really more compassionate than our ancestors, and if so, whether this might have more to do with affluence than ideology. While you can, of course, listen to MMM wherever you get your podcasts, the true home of the show is to be found at louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can find not only the extended version of this episode, but also the extended versions of hundreds of MMM podcasts, plus the weekly bonus episodes I record with other Substackers, including Rob Henderson, Megan Murphy, Nina Power, Mary Harrington, and Ed West. This is a listener-supported podcast. I am utterly reliant on paid subscribers to produce the show and keep the lights on. If you find Maiden Mother Matriarch valuable, the most helpful possible thing you can do is go to louiseperry.substack.com and sign up to become a paid subscriber for either $8 a month or $79 a year. Without paid subscribers, I really wouldn't be able to produce the podcast. So if you're willing to join their ranks, this is the key way that you can support me and support the show. Thank you.